Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again. It is Monday, and we're starting with a lot of energy, a lot of excitement as we get rocking with today's global talk. So let me introduce for every single one of you. Let's get right off the bat. Speaking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mr. James Lambert. James, the microphone is all yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. Does that allow you to see it now? People able to see?
Yep.
Yes.
Sorry about the confusion. I just, for some reason, wasn't a presenter there. Okay. So to get started, I'm sure that most of you are familiar. This is President Kennedy. This is Chairman Khrushchev. This was then Prime Minister, later President Fidel Castro. And this little paperweight here is something that John Kennedy had specially commissioned from Tiffany's after the Bay of Pigs, after a Cuban Missile Crisis was all over. You can see the dates highlighted, that the 13 days that people were on the edge of nuclear war, and everyone has a JFK up here from JFK, and then the letters of who they were to. This one was actually to his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, and this one is held at the Kennedy Library. But everybody involved at the highest levels got these. So before we get right into the Cuban Missile Crisis, I want to say a little bit about the background here. So Cuba was under Spanish control for quite a long time, a few hundred years, until 1898, when you had the Spanish-American War. And this guy here, William Randolph Hearst, he was a big newspaper publisher, then got into radio and television, movies afterwards. But at the time, he was a big newspaper publisher, and he really pushed for America to get involved in Cuba. And some of what he pushed was not real news. It was very fake news. He would make things up. He would exaggerate. He would do things like there was a woman who was being held in a Cuban jail, and he could have just paid a bribe and gotten her out of Cuban jail. But instead, he paid men to break in and sneak her out of the jail. And then he could publicize this story of how this desperate woman was being held by the Spanish and how Cuban forces, freed her from the jail. He did all these things to make Americans feel that Spain was mistreating the Cubans and we had to do something about it. And then came the USS Maine, which the Maine was an American ship that blew up in the Cuban harbor. And everybody jumped to the conclusion that the Spanish had done it. Most evidence in hindsight points to the fact that it was just too hot, and that all the combustible things on board, all of the gunpowder and things just blew up. And so we were not attacked by Spain, but we took it as an attack, and then we moved in. Americans like to see this war, where they got Cuba and the Philippines, as a war of liberation, that they were freeing these places from Spanish rule. And figures like Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders made a name for themselves going there to free the Cuban people. But not everybody in Cuba and the Philippines saw it the same way. You can see this painting here. You can kind of tell from the metal ships versus the wooden ships that Spain was very much an empire on the way out. They didn't have the technology of the day. Americans easily defeated them. And it was a time when people thought that, war was fun, that, we were rough riders going into battle and doing the right thing. So by 1902, the Americans end their occupation of Cuba and leave the Cubans in charge with the new constitution, but very much dependent on America from there on out. But if anything's not clear, or if I'm going too fast or anything, please let me know. Raise a question, just speak up. To give you an idea of the way things developed in Cuba and so many Latin American countries, we have from Batista to Castro. So Batista was a leader in Cuba. He organized basically a military revolt in the 1930s. And from then on, the presidents of Cuba were very much dependent on him and his military support. Finally, in 1940, Batista ran for presidency himself and actually got elected because he was popular at the time. Cubans thought he was this liberating figure who was going to bring prosperity to Cuba, but he just served his 4-year term and then he left. He returns to Cuba in 1952, and this time he decides that he's going to do things differently. He imposes an actual military dictatorship. He suspends the constitution that he had put in 1940, and he gets in bed with the mafia, with American big businesses. He does everything wrong from the point of view of the Cuban people, and basically everything just to enrich himself, which gives us the rise of Castro. Castro was the son of a wealthy landowner who gave up his privileged position to become a revolutionary. He was imprisoned for a while by Batista and then kicked out of the country, lived for a time in Mexico, and he finally returned with some of his followers from Mexico and became a really genuinely popular leader. But of course, he came to power much like Batista, saying, I'm going to make things better. We're going to have free and fair elections. Everybody's going to have a free voice in the country. And he ended up becoming much like Batista when he took power in 59. So in 1959, we're still looking at the end of the Eisenhower years in America. So Eisenhower did not trust Castro. And Castro came to America saying, I'm not a communist. I'm not going to be a dictator. I'm not going to be any of these things you fear. And then slowly word started to come out about what was actually happening in Cuba, that even Castro's friends would help him get into power were now being arrested and executed. So it didn't look good. And then Castro started making gestures to the Soviet Union, started getting arms and other aid from, food aid and whatnot from the Eastern Bloc countries. And so Americans became convinced that Castro was no better than any other dictator, and they didn't want to have a communist country 90 miles away from their shores. So Eisenhower gives a green light to a plan that says, let's just look at ways of taking out Castro. When Kennedy comes in 1960, he's never done anything like this. He's never run a country. He's never run a large-scale operation as Eisenhower had as a military leader. And he pretty much just goes along with the CIA plan as it is and says he wants them to tone it down a little bit, but he basically says, yeah, let's go in and take out Fidel Castro. So he tries this operation. It was originally called Trinidad because they were going to land at a place, at a city of Trinidad in Cuba. And when Kennedy says, I don't want it to be that big of an operation, I want to land someplace more discreet, they changed the name to Zapata. Nobody really noticed that the place they were going to land at was called the Bay of Pigs, which is a horrible name, for history. Obviously, it just conjures up images of a disaster. And so in April 1962, just a few months into his presidency, this false invasion, well, it's a real invasion, but it's falsely a Cuban-led operation, when really it's an American operation using mostly Cubans, goes into the Bay of Pigs and everything goes wrong. There's coral under the water, so they can't transport in their equipment very well. There's no place for them to run and hide like there was in Trinidad. And the air cover that they thought they had, Kennedy cancels because he thinks it's too much. And it just turns into a complete disaster. Kennedy tries to distance himself from this, says, it wasn't me, I didn't, we didn't mean for this to happen. We were just trying to help out the Cubans, but it wasn't really us, and nobody quite believes it. But that's where things just kind of lay for the time being. In the background, Kennedy's brother, the Attorney General, uses the CIA to try and kill Castro and try to sabotage businesses in Cuba. And this is all called Operation Mongoose. And it's very clear to Castro that the Kennedys are still out to get him. So that makes him get in with the Soviets even more. And finally, we'll get to the point where the Soviets start secretly bringing missiles in. So Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, his view of Cuba is something that's not normally talked about, but from the 1919, when the communists took over Russia, until 1959, every communist revolution had either been controlled by or heavily supported by Moscow. The Cuban Revolution is the first independent communist revolution. And many people like Khrushchev think this is a sign that the world's going to go communist, that we didn't even have to do anything and Cuba went communist. Khrushchev also thinks that the United States is no better than the Soviet Union because look what they just did in the Bay of Pigs. And so he's not so impressed with America taking the moral high ground. And a big takeaway is that he thinks that JFK is weak. And all of these things are going to play into the way the Cuban Missile Crisis develops. So you basically have the Soviets thinking, here is the way of the future. We're going to help the Cubans every way we can. Kennedy is weak. Kennedy thinking, we have to get the communists off of our shores. And this is all tied together, that somehow the Cuban Revolution is controlled by Moscow. And Castro just wants the best deal he can get for Cuba. So each has their own agenda. So take a break from my talking, and I gave you a couple of things that you can discuss here, but I'd be open to any questions, thoughts, things that you feel I've left out or that are important or things that don't make sense. I just want to open it up to anybody who wants to say anything or ask anything. Feel free. Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Anyone want to take a stab at are covert operations justified?
I have a question. So
Yeah.
basically, what we're saying is involving like just Cuba, United States, and Soviet Union. Do you know that if you can get into other countries that were involved in the conflict?
Other countries that were involved in which part of the conflict? Directly in Cuba?
Now, directly in Cuba, like with the aspect of pointing fingers to Russia, well, to the Soviet Union, Cuba, or pointing fingers to someone, like making a resolution and making someone the one that's the responsible of the conflict.
Like who was ultimately responsible? Is that what
So
you're?
like who are involved in like making someone responsible for the conflict, or like in a sort of resolution. I mean, I know like the whole world pointed the Soviet Union, but I don't know if you can tell us which countries were like in sort of supporting one side or another.
Sure. So basically, the Soviet Union had, after World War II, had a number of countries under their control, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, that basically went along with them and were helping the Cubans, but were not necessarily calling any of the shots. It was just the Soviets. Whereas on the American side, the Americans were pretty much running the show, but they definitely had support from like the UK and to some degree certain states within the Americas, particularly Guatemala is where they were training the Cubans who were going to invade. And so you basically had America working with some dictatorships in the Americas, primarily Guatemala, and then the Soviet Union giving aid oftentimes through their satellite countries. But it really, everybody, the only people who were calling the shots were Khrushchev and Kennedy. There was nobody else who could in any way vote on what was happening or overrule them in any way. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Other questions or thoughts? What do people think about people intervening in some other country, putting in and out?
About that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I think that maybe when other countries could intervene is like when it affects the whole world or like the safety of other people, but at the same time, you can think, well, Russia just attacked Ukraine. So maybe like Ukraine, what Putin says is that Ukraine joining NATO is threatening him because he's going to have military bases, like basically close to where he is. But then we're sanctioning his interference. So, like, until what point can that get? And, like, what do you think about the relationship or the similarities between the Cuban Missile Crisis and this new Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Well, I guess I'd want to see what other people think first. I don't want to show mine, but what do other people think? Is it justified to invade your neighbor? And if it is, under what conditions? Is there a way for me to? Oops.
I think there are a couple of hands raised.
Yeah. Do I need to do anything or just call on them?
Oh yeah, you can just call on them.
Okay. Pablo, you asked the question before. Do you want to follow up on something?
Yeah, so basically I think it's really similar, but the fact that in the past, the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was like a real attack and a real like military bases, and I think that's why it's sort of similar, but at the same time, it's nothing concrete. So it's it's going to the same situation, but the United Nations has built up a lot of more protocols and like actions to avoid what could happen again. Yeah, I don't know. It's similar, but it's still being like like really far of what we've been seeing.
Yeah, I think there's definitely similarities, but certainly differences that I think are key. Who's this? I know I'm going to slaughter your name. Is it T?
Theodelina, you can call me Theo.
Theo. Okay.
Okay. Well, as for the right a country has to invade another one, a country can intervene in another's like internal issues as long as this country allows it to. Like that's why, for example, the naval blockade of the US over Cuba was illegal. Because the country has to allow it. It's between them both, and that's why Russia can't invade Ukraine, because Ukraine is against it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that is many people's position. I guess I wonder what happens when you get into a situation like Rwanda, where there aren't people there to consent. Where you've got one group of people killing another group of people, and there's nobody to really kind of consent to it. Then what do you do?
Like, I guess it would be up to the UN to intervene there, and when a conflict can't be solved between the two countries, like it's the UN's job to mediate there and try to reach a solution.
What do other people think?
Like I would really like, and I would think that basically it really depends on like the country and how the resolution is and why are they encouraged to do their actions. So like I don't think that basically the United Nations probably would not intervene in a situation like Ukraine, Russia. We've seen like all economic sanctions. They have not been doing something, and like I really think they rather the conflict solve their conflict between them than like intervening.
It's a new hand here. Is it
I'd
Camilla?
say, yeah, maybe she can go first.
Camilla?
Okay, well, I think most of y'all aren't considering that like the Security Council of the United Nations has China, Russia, and the United States in the same like council. So for a resolution to pass, these I don't know how many votes, but they have to be in favor, and they can use a veto power on each other. So for a resolution paper to pass, you need these countries to be like working together. So our resolution paper only will pass if these are like all in favor of the same thing, which will be basically impossible for China, the USSR, and the US to be in favor of, oh, don't invade. They like the USSR, China, and the US have a history of breaking treaties in speaking of nuclear weapons. So they are covering their crimes between each other and not they are not going to admit to their crimes to the UN. So I think it's very like pretty much impossible that the UN can go and do whatever, like impose things over the US or the USSR's actions. That's just my position.
I mean, just to be realistic, not since the Korean War, when the UN voted to go in to help the South Koreans. The UN has never taken an action again like that. That only happened because the Soviet Union stayed away. They were boycotting the vote. Afterwards, they realized it was better to go veto than to boycott. So it is really almost impossible to get them to agree now. And so that leaves us still with the question, is it right for an individual country or a group of countries to decide on their own to do something? Santiago?
It's really hard because for one part you have the issue that every state is sovereign and can do whatever it wants, but then at the same time, if there's proof that there's another group of people or that the government or anybody is threatening another group of people, that's where I believe they should intervene, maybe at first diplomatically and as last resort, like just violently, but that we shouldn't get to that. The problem is also like the vetoes. It's very hard, for example, now with Ukraine. Everybody, the UK, France, and the United States voted in favor of sanctioning Russia. Then Russia used its power for the veto, and China abstained from the vote. So it's basically the same thing. Nobody did anything. They didn't achieve anything. So I'd say the best solution is just to remove the veto from all the countries. There shouldn't be like a country that has more privileges over another, but I doubt that will happen because it's going to be very hard.
Right, because you have to get the country to not use their veto to eliminate the veto.
Yeah, precisely.
Yes. Yeah, it is a very difficult situation. And I don't know how you get around that. Pablo?
So, like, basically, the problem is that right now you don't need the United Nations to intervene to sanction it economically a country. As you might see with Russia, there's no United Nations intervention in the way that the United Nations has not imposed an economic sanction, but the countries from the United Nations that are pointing their fingers to Russia, they're basically just cutting the economic relationship and the commercial ones. So basically, right now in such a globalized economy, every country needs each other. So I think the United Nations when they act in a certain way and imposing economic sanctions, they're not needing that because everybody can cut every single country economy. So I really think the United Nations should be as I said, I think the veto should be removed, and basically that's the only thing that's needed for built up better United Nations. I don't know.
Yeah, I assume most of you are aware, originally after World War I, there was the League of Nations, which had no power and was really unable to do anything. And then after World War II, we got the United Nations, which doesn't have any power, but has a little more prestige and a little bit more ability to coordinate things, but still is a far cry from what we're expecting it to do. Alexa.
Yes, I just wanted to add that we also have to look at the facts because Russia's invasion to Ukraine is not the same as the USSR invasion to Cuba. So we can compare those two. So we have to look at also what history both countries have, because USSR also was benefited by the invasion to Cuba because he sustained the revolution, and so they had like interest in common. But with Russia's invasion to Ukraine, it's more like a territory claim because Kiev was part of Russia, and so it's another kind of invasion. But yes, well, I don't think that countries should just invade. They should have dialogue first, and then if dialogue doesn't work, then invasions could come to the table. But well, at least I don't think it's fair to just invade the country because there's problems that weren't talked about.
I totally agree with what you were saying, but you always have to have in mind that like world powers are not always like in a total agreement with each others, and basically it's very difficult because they all want to have more power, and that's where a lot of problems come to the United Nations and basically the whole world. I don't know, it's very difficult, and I'm totally agree with the part you were saying that they were saying us that it should not be something usual to foreign powers to invade other countries, but it's a reality and it's real difficult to work on that. And basically, it's you just gotta deal with it. I don't know, this sounds a little bad, but what are you going to do about it? Right now, there are nukes, and that's the end of the discussion. If something, if a world power is losing, they just say nukes, and I think that's the problem right now.
Camilla, did you still have another thing to say, or were you?
I just wanted to add that the UN, the only thing they can do right now are economic, like imposing economic. I don't remember the word, but like economic actions on Russia, and Russia buy other countries that like Russia exports like 30% of the gas in the world, and Russia can't be more economically affected right now because no one wants to export to Russia. No one wants Russian things. No one wants Russia near them. And Russia is still going with what they're doing. So it's not like I tell you, oh, you pay me this kind of money, and they are like, whoa, I'm not gonna attack Ukraine anymore. Like they are like aware of the damage they're doing to Ukraine and to themselves, and they aren't planning on stopping. So do you think like money is going to stop them? Like this is just Putin's madness, and it's not going to stop with money. Or even if you invade Russia, I don't think they will stop until they get what they want. So like the UN is a very honorable organization that has incredible actions with helping countries that may not be in the most favorable situation. But in these cases where you have like a country that has a very great power over other country, and the country is not a member of NATO, like there's nothing they can do unless like sending but that's the decision of each country. The US can send missiles and can send food and can send help, but nobody's going to aid Russia, Ukraine in the way they would want to, even the UN. So it's not like that easy.
Yes, it's basically, if the situation gets complicated, you can just send some nuclear. But what's the point in there? Basically, that's just going to be the solution. Like saying, oh, if you attack me or if you do something that I'm not agree with, I'm just going to send you a nuke. And basically, that's the United Nations right now. Even though somebody gets affected, they'll just say the country or the government deal with it because there are nuclears, and the humanity depends on avoiding the use of these weapons.
Yeah, precisely. Like nuclear weapons, well, it has been proven with Hiroshima and Nagasaki how deadly they can be. Thankfully, they have only been used in this. Well, I mean, not thankfully, because it would be better for them to not have been used on any conflict, but at least they have only been used in one and not like in 5 or something like that. But yeah, like precisely, it's very hard because it's not only Putin's madness, but also I believe Zelensky's ego for trying to be like a hero. And I believe that like negotiation is the way. The problem is that you either like Russia gives Ukraine everything that they want, or Ukraine gives Russia everything that they want. There's no like middle point, probably. So that's what makes this conflict hard. Both parts want everything, especially Russia.
Yeah,
Well-
but I'm sorry.
I'll let you say the last thing, and then we'll go on for a little bit, and then come back to discussion.
No, I was gonna say about what Santiago mentioned. I mean, actually, what happened here is that the two nations don't get like with an agreement. I mean, Russia wants something and Ukraine wants something. Why they don't get to an agreement? I mean, it's very hard because this is a war, and the both don't wanna like give access of what they want. So I guess that the best here is like get to a balance, get to an agreement with the both. But if none of them what it is like kind of, well, it's not dumb because I mean there is with the humans there is a limit. I mean there is something more further than what we know because we as humans, as civilized persons, uh, most of the times we tried with persuasion, we try to convince others for something, but here the both sides are like closer to hear the other. So it's very difficult. It's very hard because both of them are like putting or their nation life of children's mothers, basically older nation. They're putting life in between this, and that's very difficult, very hard. But they don't get to an agreement. So there is something more further than that, and just for the pride of the humans because they don't get to an agreement. I mean, sometimes this type of things, I mean, for the value that life have, um, sometimes we need like to set things, and that's what they are not doing. Even they don't try it, they go for the more natural part, I will say, the natural part of the human that we want, the ones that not like civilized stuff. They go for that instinct. So that was what I was gonna say. They don't get to an agreement basically. And both can because both are like mad and they don't wanna set anything. So it's very difficult.
It is very difficult. People don't do what you expect them to do. People don't, yeah. Everybody has, as was mentioned before, some things are about ego and some things are about madness and some things are about greed and some things are about honor. You know, there are so many motivations going in. So let me just get into more the actual Cuban Missile Crisis here for a little bit. So I advance to my next slide. You can see this is what the actual the U-2 spy plane photos look like. And then obviously they put in little markers of what you're looking at. So this is a CIA spy plane that was used to fly over Cuba and other areas that America was, suspicious about. And this is how President Kennedy found out that there were missile sites being built in Cuba, and there were more boats coming that were going to probably deliver even more missiles. So everybody was afraid that this would be the start of World War III. And the American military in particular thought that nuclear war was really inevitable. It wasn't so much that they were wanting it, but they had convinced themselves that now that we had nuclear weapons, we were going to end up using them. And so at the point of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union had a couple thousand nuclear weapons. America had about 20,000 nuclear weapons. And so the American military thought, now is the time. If we have to have a nuclear war, let's have it now. We'll be less damaged than them. But we're still talking about, hundreds of millions of people dead, which obviously nobody in charge wanted to be the person who, was the greatest mass murderer in history. So in October 1962, after Kennedy saw these images, for a week, he keeps it a secret and he tries to decide what to do. He pretends to have a cold so that he doesn't have to go out into public for a while. He forms this group, the XCOM group, led by his brother, Robert. And they do a lot of comical kind of things to try to avoid the press, like cramming 10 people into a car, like a clown car, and driving into the White House and then unloading everybody so that the press doesn't notice that they're having meetings. But finally, XCOM, after going back and forth on should they bomb the sites, should they directly confront the Soviets about this, what should they do? They decide to blockade Cuba and to say that nothing more is going to come into Cuba until the Soviets agree to take the missiles out and not bring any more in. And so this is the position that they take. And after that, you get Adlai Stevenson. He was our ambassador to the UN. He had run for president twice himself against Eisenhower, lost both times. And so for a lot of people on the left in America, Adlai Stevenson was their hero. He was the one guy brave enough to try to take on Eisenhower in the presidential race. And he was considered a really level-headed, honest guy. The problem was when the Bay of Pigs happened, nobody told Adlai Stevenson that we were doing it. So he stood up in front of the United Nations and said, no, we're not invading Cuba. We have nothing to do with what's going on in Cuba. And he was proved a liar, but he didn't know it. So now when the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, even though he had a lot of nice pictures to show, he had a hard time convincing some people that he was being honest because he had lost his reputation based on the Bay of Pigs. But we moved in our forces to blockade, and we continued to have U-2 spy flights. There's one flight that was knocked down, and there are different stories about this, but most of the evidence that I've read says that Castro personally made the Soviets shoot down that plane, that Khrushchev had given orders not to shoot at American spy planes. He didn't want to escalate the situation. But Castro said, you're in my country, that plane's flying over my country, shoot it down. And the local Russian commanders were intimidated. They shot down this one plane. And so this one Major Anderson became the lone casualty of this conflict. But at the time, it didn't seem like he was the lone casualty. It seemed like he was the first, and that this situation was just going to escalate. And it was Kennedy thought it would spread to Berlin, that the Soviets would invade Berlin, and that everything would just get quickly out of their control. And so here's some things to give you a sense of what people thought at the time. So Khrushchev's son, Sergei, who later moved to America after the Soviet Union fell, he moved to America and he became a history professor. But he wrote that his father at the time felt it was at this moment, once the American pilot was shot down, it was at this moment that the situation seemed to just be slipping out of control, that everybody was too removed from the situation to keep it under control. There were too many people who could start firing at one another at any time and spread this conflict. Robert Kennedy, when he later wrote about this, said there was a feeling that the noose was tightening on all of us, on Americans, on mankind, and that the bridges to escape were crumbling, that people were feeling hopeless, and that there was just no way to stop this. And as Kennedy said to his aides at the time, it isn't the first step that concerns me, but both sides escalating to the fourth or fifth steps, and we don't get to the sixth step because there's no one around to do so. That if we start firing in Cuba, the Soviets are going to invade Berlin. The North Koreans are going to invade South Korea again, that all these things are going to start happening where we can't control it. And before we know it, we're going to be launching our nuclear weapons, and then there won't be anybody to make any further choices. So finally, there was messages going back and forth. And finally, Khrushchev sends a message to Kennedy that looks for a way out of the crisis. And for Khrushchev, a man who only went to like 5 or 6 grades of education, this is quite a poetic and compelling message that he sent. I just gave a few pieces of it here. He said, "I have participated in 2 wars and know that war ends when it has rolled through cities and villages, everywhere sowing death and destruction. Mr. President, we and you ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the 2 of us pull, the tighter the knot will become, the tighter the knot will be. If there is no intention to tighten the knot and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, but let us take measures to untie the knot. We are ready for this." So Khrushchev seems very much like, not only does he want to end this conflict, but he wants to de-escalate the problems between the US and the Soviet Union. The problem is that after this message was received, Khrushchev sends another message that is much more harsh and much more of a "we're ready to fight" message. And the American side is thinking that Khrushchev got bullied by the people underneath him into sending this harsh message. And so after talking over with his advisors, Kennedy decides, we'll just pretend like we never got the second message and we'll reply to the first message. And that's the point at which things start to de-escalate. They say, okay, if Khrushchev wants to make a deal, let's make a deal, and just ignore all of the other rhetoric, ignore the fact that somebody was shot down. Let's just move forward with the deal. He sends his brother Robert over to the Soviet embassy secretly, without the press knowing. And they say, look, we have missiles in Turkey that we know you don't like because they're on your border. We will take those missiles out, and we will promise to never invade Cuba. We'll never try another Bay of Pigs. And the Soviets accept that. But of course, our promises they had to trust, because we weren't going to put it in writing that we were making this deal. They had to trust us, and we did follow through on that deal afterwards. The Soviets immediately had to turn their ships around, and they did. There was a little bit of back and forth of where they're going to turn around or not, but ultimately they did. And so the situation quickly de-escalated once we decided to make a deal. And so here's my quick take on the aftermath of what happened. Castro felt very upset and betrayed, really, because he wasn't consulted by Khrushchev at all. He was left out of the loop. And so he felt like the Soviets were acting much like the Americans had acted to Cuba, like that Cubans don't really count, and that the Cubans were just being told what to do now by the Soviets rather than the Americans. But Castro was able to hold on to power, and he lasted through the next 8 presidents, only finally leaving power on the 9th president, Barack Obama. Khrushchev, his fate was not so lucky. Within 2 years of the Cuban Missile Crisis, those who felt he had been weak were finally able to push him out of office. He was not killed or imprisoned or any things that might have happened in the Stalinist days, but he was pushed out of office and no longer had any power. In less than a year from the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and the UK signed a deal with the USSR to ban certain nuclear testing, all above ground nuclear testing. And then later they would ban underground nuclear testing. And President Kennedy said when he went around America and talked to people, he could tell that things had changed, that just that signing that treaty and saying we're not going to test nuclear weapons anymore made people feel like nuclear war was no longer inevitable and made them feel hopeful for the first time. The other thing that happened is that Kennedy had been, denying America's role in the Bay of Pigs, but after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he was popular and things seemed good, then he finally put the weight of the White House into making a deal with Castro, and something like, I believe, about 1,200 men who had been captured in the Bay of Pigs were finally released from Cuba on Christmas Eve, 1962, after America sent a lot of aid, mostly medical aid, to Cuba. The Soviet Union and America continued to fight in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan, and there continued to be conflicts, but something had changed where those conflicts stayed local after this. People didn't feel like everything had to escalate to nuclear war because they had come so close that now they just kind of took the nuclear weapons off the table and said, we might fight you here, we might fight you there, but we're not going to bringing in the nuclear weapons. There was no formal deal, but that's just the reality of what happened after that. All right, so here are my follow-up questions. And as before, anything you want to say. But I do always wonder, have we really learned anything from history? And I do wonder, could we still face a nuclear situation? How would that manifest differently now that we don't have these two superpowers standing off against each other in the same way that they were before? And do people feel that anybody was really right or wrong in this situation? Or was it a matter of people simply seeing things differently? And if anybody has an idea on how this could have been handled differently, please share your thoughts. Who wants to go first? Oh, let's see. Somebody from Norway? Julie?
Yeah, I had a question from a while ago.
Oh, sorry.
When was it made public that missiles were removed from Turkey?
I don't think that came out officially until the Freedom of Information Act, which in the United States, we passed the Freedom of Information Act in the 1970s, which said that people could petition the government to get records that were no longer secret. And I don't think that we officially got any proof until the 1970s that we had made that deal.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Other questions, comments, feelings? Yes. Santiago.
Responding? Yeah, thank you. Responding to those questions, I believe that first of all, well, maybe the crisis could have been handled before the US immediately took action, maybe to discuss with Castro and with the USSR, like what was happening, and then recurred to actual military blockades and sanctions and all of that, just to prevent anybody from getting like angry or mad and just throwing a missile, because that would have been a disaster. So like basically trying to negotiate and to make everybody feel calm, that they don't need to start a war and all of that. And I'd say that there were no rights and wrongs, in this part because both the USSR and the USA really threatened like the whole world with this conflict, and also Cuba, of course. And as we talked before with the sovereignty of a state, like it's really difficult to say if the USA should have intervened or not, because while Castro was devastating a lot of people and harming them, well, at the same time, the Cuban country is sovereign, so they can technically do whatever they want, and it's still not exactly permitted for the US to invade them, right? And that could have made a really big problem if the Cuban Missile Crisis escalated. And like also the USSR, by putting the missiles close to the US, but well, at the same time, the US did the same thing with Turkey. And like trying to, like all of the nations contributed to almost destroy the whole humanity if they were to engage in a nuclear war, which thankfully did not occur. And about if we could still face a nuclear war, well, some years ago I would have said that it would be very unlikely. Right now I still think it might not be like that, but with Putin being that mad and also threatening for any country that directly interferes, like not without aid, but that directly attacks them or something, he has really said that he's going to use his arsenal, right? And he has very powerful missiles, which are terrible for humanity. So I think that while it's unlikely, because I don't think that the Ukraine conflict is going to escalate more than it has, if Putin slips and throws a missile or does an attack to any nation who's already in NATO, especially Turkey and Poland, which are like very close to the conflict, or if NATO starts secretly aiding Ukraine and Putin finds out, we might be threatened by a possible nuclear war. But let's hope that none of them slip and that this conflict ends a lot. And I believe that, yes, we have learned a lot from history. Like right now, we have learned how situations should be handled first from the peaceful, diplomatic side of things, because if not, it can become a very big problem from humanity. And also, moving to another topic, we can talk about the Holocaust, which has made us, create the UN and other organizations that at least try to do something. It isn't always possible, as we said before. But in general, it has also made us learn more about being more tolerant and learning the world humans, that we should respect each other, to make more laws and decrees and all of that, protecting every type of people, and like in general with education, to know that we don't want that to repeat anymore or another time. So we should try everything to stop it. So in general, yes, we have learned a lot from history, and that's why it's important to study it. Not only because it's fun, at least for me, but because we really learn how things happened and how we can prevent them. Or we can also find some solutions from history that have been used in the past and that we can use for current problems too.
Thank you. You give me hope. Camilla and then Marina.
Okay, so regarding the wrong or right question, I don't think, especially talking about the USSR and the US, there's no one that's wrong or right, because even World War II ended up being a conflict of who grabs the small country with a bad economic situation first to use it as a launch pad. So they both are morally wrong, but like, which country hasn't done anything that's morally wrong? But what I think is like the most morally wrong is that the US had their missiles on Turkey since the 50s, like 1950s. And it wasn't until 1962 that the USSR said, oh, this bothers me, let me make a conflict. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that they didn't realize, or they didn't, like, they weren't bothered by the missiles on Turkey until 12 years later. It's like, I don't know, like a call for attention, or a call for like fighting, or a call for, I don't know what they were trying to do, because they just brought themselves more like bad fame for what they were doing. And they grabbed Cuba because Cuba was like in a crisis, and they saw it as like hope for the communists. And I think it's very egoist of Khrushchev to put these missiles, because the range of the missiles will hit northern Mexico and southern Canada, and they didn't have any conflict with Mexico or Canada. Like, what did they do to you for you to like be angry with the US and affect everyone around them? Like, it's not fair, and it's not good to like have the missiles. Like what happens if like an accident happens or a misunderstanding, and you free those missiles and you kill everyone in southern Canada and North Mexico? Like, how are you gonna feel? It's like I think that's like the climax of the conflict, and that's the most morally wrong thing that was done. But I'm not saying the US doesn't involve themselves in things that don't concern them for money. That's a reality from the both like powers. So I don't think no one is wrong or right, but the way that conflict was started by the USSR putting the missiles in Cuba and the missiles in Turkey being 12 years ago, it's like it doesn't make sense to me.
I see what you're saying. I will say that the Soviets had no opportunity to put missiles near the US until Cuba. And so, it wasn't that they got mad 12 years later. It was that they had no opportunity to do anything.
Oh, of course, like Mexico wasn't gonna do that. Canada wasn't gonna do it.
Right.
Panama, Costa Rica, nobody wasn't gonna do that. But Cuba is a whole different story. So like US is surrounded by little like islands that belong to them, and they were like, I think, in control of Cuba, or kind of controlling Cuba. So when they put their hands off Cuba, the Soviets say, oh, this is mine now, and I'm putting this here because Turkey missiles are there, so it's mine now.
Marina?
Yeah, I had a question. Since we were talking about Turkey having missiles, I don't believe that the United States had the missiles put in Turkey, but they just agreed to put them there because Turkey was threatened by the USSR. And I would like to know about it more in depth, since my role is Turkey, and it affected Turkey a lot, having the nuclear missiles off. Like, they still had the missiles, but just not the nuclear head, right? And I would like to know more about why Turkey felt so threatened that they felt like they needed to have this, and more about like the consequences of having the missiles removed for Turkey in both economic ways and in the hopes of the people.
Unfortunately, I can't speak to the economics, but I am pretty confident in saying that the missiles that were in Turkey were considered obsolete by America. And so we didn't have that much of a problem taking them out. We had to convince the Turks that we still had their back because we had missiles elsewhere, like in Europe, that could easily defend them. There's the reason why I would say the Turks felt threatened is because there's a long history before the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union, when it was Russia, between the Ottoman Empire that became Turkey and Russia. They were on opposite sides of the First World War, and they have a long history going back before that the Turks legitimately had concern about having another war with Russia, now the Soviet Union. And so we put missiles there, but in time they became obsolete. And so it was much easier for us to convince them that we could protect them with our better missiles that were now in Europe.
Thank you. And I also have another question. So basically, the Turks were like, the Turkey is also in NATO, right? And I would like to know more about how they agreed to remove the missiles, because from my point of view, it wouldn't have been that easy even if they were obsolete, because they were something that we're giving them even like a stance in the international like point of view, like they were viewed as important. And then when, as I read, and then when they removed the missiles, they weren't seen like as important. They like lost importance to the other countries. And I believe that they knew that this would happen, and also that the people would be very mad at this. So why did the Turks agree to it?
I wish I knew more about the Turkish side of it, but I can tell you that pretty much Turkey and the Middle East were largely ignored through most of the Cold War. We went to them when we wanted something from them, and we ignored them largely most of the time. And if they wanted our aid, our grain, our whatnot, you know, at the time, pretty much the Soviet Union and America got what they wanted. And they were going to find one way or another. Either you agree to this or there will be consequences. And so I think that later came back to bite America with problems in the Middle East, and with like when America went to invade Iraq, Turkey refused to participate. You know, it's like, I think that a number of nations have felt used in the Cold War and largely ignored. You know, their feelings didn't matter. It was just about what did the Soviets or the Americans want from them.
Thank you very much.
Santiago?
Also, another question. Was the US economically sanctioned, such as Russia? I know they're two like isolated cases, but such as Russia with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And if not, why wasn't it as sanctioned as, or why weren't both the US and the USSR sanctioned in that conflict, as opposed to now where Russia is being heavily backlashed by all the international community when economically speaking?
I mean, I think the reality of politics is that either America, the Soviet Union, or a group of countries within the UN need to instigate something. And as was discussed earlier, because of the veto power, the UN was pretty much helpless. Either America or the Soviet Union could veto anything. So even though somebody like, say, France might want to broker a deal or get nations to come together for sanctions, they didn't have the clout to do that. Whereas America and the Soviet Union could instigate those kinds of things, but I don't think anybody else was in a powerful enough position to do that. I also think that people were genuinely afraid of missiles being put in Cuba because it had been done in secret. You know, you can argue about whether or not we should have put missiles in Turkey, but that was done openly. Whereas all of a sudden there were just missiles in Cuba, and I think the world was very afraid of what was going to happen, and they weren't thinking about who was right or wrong. They just were afraid.
Yeah, I understand. In general, all of these conflicts are very complicated to treat and to discuss. But yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? I think, yeah, we've gone over our time, but that's fine. Anybody want to have a final last word? Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, I will do the thank you thing. Thank you for joining me on this today. It's the first time I've done one of these. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And I hope you got something valuable out of it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Everyone, please a huge
Thank
round
you.
of applause for James right there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very
James.
much.
Thank you, James,
Thank
so
you.
much. Guys, thank you guys so much for attending this talk, for participating, for engaging. I know those are very complex subjects. Nonetheless, seeing the thoughts that you as future leaders, as young leaders from around the world have is definitely very encouraging and very hopeful for humanity. So once again, thank you so much. James, I don't know if you have any last words for us.
No, I think I've said enough.
All right, amazing then. Thank you, everyone. See you once again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Chicago to carry onwards with our program. See you around. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye, everyone.